We're into the last week of the planned legislative session. Will they pass a budget? We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Legislature's been working. They may be working this entire holiday weekend. We'll see if that works out as planned. With me to discuss it, a couple of State House veterans, which is great. Charlie Wheeler is back. He is director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at University of Illinois Springfield, longtime Chicago Sun-Times State House reporter before that. Charlie, welcome back.
Thank you, Bernie. It's always fun to be here.
And Brian Mackey is here, State House reporter for NPR Illinois, that radio station, also known as WUIS, out at the university, and statewide, correct?
Yeah, we have a network of about a dozen NPR stations.
Which means that voice carries far. So, state budget, there have been meetings going on. The governor has met with legislative leaders. How are things looking as we talk about it here today?
Well, it's frighteningly calm and optimistic for those of us who have been used to the strife and battles of the past couple of years. People seem to be both upbeat and also not saying that much, which the legislative leaders have held a couple of meetings this week and not spoken to reporters afterwards, which, you know, there's a way of reading the tea leaves in Springfield that's a good sign, because if they come out and start bashing each other in front of the cameras, then that's a signal that things are going badly. The governor himself has done a number of media availabilities this week, including one in the actual press room in Springfield, which I believe is the first time a sitting governor has done any sort of news conference in that press room.
Oh, because it was remodeled during his
since
administration?
2013. And Governor Quinn never showed up there either. So, and he did not take questions, which, you know, they announced that ahead of time.
He took one question on the topic of they were there with the state police discussing, you know, move away from, if you see someone on the side of the road with flashing lights, move over a lane. He discussed one thing about traffic, but then when it went to other topics, he did not answer.
So, I mean, if the governor's not answering questions because, you know, sometimes his passions and his distaste for some of the players and the traditions in Illinois government can overtake him, and he can say something that maybe affect negotiations. So nobody's talking to the press. The point is that, you know, as we tape this, you know, toward the end of the week, and things can change by the hour here, but things seem to be on track to try and get a budget done by the end of May. The big question is, will the governor sign it? And that is an open question, but the legislators, the Democrats, say that, you know, we're working well with the Republicans, so whether the governor signs it or they end up overriding his veto doesn't really matter to from the Democratic standpoint, as long as they get a budget passed.
All right, and, you know, just to set the framework, the legislature, the fiscal year ends at the end of June, but the legislature's planned spring session ends May 31st, which is next Thursday. And after that, it takes more votes to pass something that's going to take effect in the new year, in the new fiscal year, which starts July 1. So they just need a simple majority to pass the budget now, and then after that May 31st deadline, it's extraordinary majority. It's 36 votes in the Senate and 71 in the House instead of 30 and 60. And Charlie, I'm wondering, and you're always the guy whenever people introduce budgets who, in my experience, ask the best questions in the room when they are there to actually, you know, take those questions, you know, early in the process. But the governor this year proposed various things that are included in the budget, like the sale of the James R. Thompson Center in Chicago is, you know, a couple $100 million or something, transferring several $100 million in pension costs from what the state pays for downstate teachers to the school districts. And it seems that some of these things are not going to be part of what the Democratic legislature is going to want to pass. So, you know, where do you see the process going, and do you think that they can reach agreement, the governor would back off some of these things?
I think in a sense the governor is in jeopardy of making himself irrelevant on this. And the reason I say it is, if he decides to stonewall and not accept whatever budget is presented to him by this bipartisan working group and the legislative leaders, I think the votes are going to be there to override him. He was overridden last year, and I don't think there's any more desire of sitting lawmakers to prolong a budget fight throughout the summer raising questions in people's minds. Will schools open on time? Will the universities be able to carry on? They don't want to hear that back home. And so their goal is going to be able to put something together. At a guess, I would say maybe selling the Thompson Center would be part of a way to patch the hole. I don't think they're going to shift costs to local governments. School districts uniformly across the state have objected to that, and there's a lot of analysis that suggests if you pass these pension costs onto school districts, you're saving the state money that would be paid in income and sales taxes largely, but you're putting the burden on local school districts, which derive most of their money from property taxes. So it's, you're taking it out of one pocket when you're saying I'm putting it in the other one. So that doesn't make sense. And I don't think the notion that he can cut, $500 million from health care, he can't do that unilaterally. That's in court right now. So I don't think you can really count upon those things. You have to look for ways to manage the big ticket items, and I suspect there'll be some borrowing from other funds in there. There may be continuation of taking a little bit of money from the income tax share that goes to local governments.
Which mayors are very upset about.
They're upset about continuing to charge the local governments for administering their portion of the sales taxes. Those kinds of, in a sense, nickel-dime things that over a wide range of areas can add up to some real money. I think that's probably what we're going to see. But I would be very surprised if a month from now we're still here worried about will the legislature pass a budget for the fiscal year that will start in a couple days.
Yeah, I mean, people who watchdog groups and budget observers and bond rating agencies, they don't like these things called one-time revenues. They prefer recurring revenue source. So one recurring revenue source is the income tax. Everybody pays taxes every year.
Right.
One-time revenue is something like selling the Thompson Center. I was at a presentation from S&P, the
Standard & Poor's.
Standard & Poor's, the bond rating agency, and one of their big state government people who's responsible for Illinois sort of made a tongue-in-cheek comment that, we've put the selling the Thompson Center in the budget so many years in a row now, it's practically become a recurring revenue source.
And it's still complicated. I mean, as we know, there's a CTA,
right,
station under in the ground
so this
floor.
is,
They
I
have to work
actually
with the
talked to
city.
some Democrats about this on Thursday morning, and one of them told me, look, we don't want to do that sort of sham thing in the budget. One said, we're not going to put that in if we can't get to a real agreement on actually being able to sell the thing. Another Democrat, though, told me that we had a willing buyer last year, but because the governor and the mayor couldn't work out their disagreements, the governor wanted some exemptions from zoning laws in the city, which the city did not want to give up that control. But the thinking is, and again, this is subject to change by the hour at the end of session like this, but if they can't get to some real agreement to actually make these things happen, they're not going to just sort of put them in to paper over their differences. But they are reportedly only a couple $100 million apart. And when you're talking about, 30-something in general revenue, $80 billion budget, that's a rounding error.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, and Charlie, you alluded to it earlier. I mean, last year you had, I think it was 15 Republicans in the House that voted for the budget the governor didn't want, including a tax increase. They don't need to do the tax increase this year because they have it. It's already there. It's up to 4.95% for individuals. And then I think it was 10 of those Republicans in the House also voted for the override. Now, I think it's like 9 of them are not running for re-election. But this is also an election year, so wouldn't Republicans want to work harder to keep everybody in line with their governor who's running for re-election in this year? Wouldn't it be harder to vote for an override this year, even though they're not going to be in office? I guess it depends on how you look at it. I think you come down on the other side.
I come down on the other side because I think the bottom line is if I'm a lawmaker, here's Governor Big Bucks. He's thrown a lot of money at the party. He owns it. But on the other hand, I have to answer to my constituents. I have to answer to the parents who are worried about schools opening.
But if you got like a Republican district and they don't want J.B. Pritzker, the Democrat, to be the next governor because he wants a progressive income tax, which he says won't hurt the middle class, it will only hurt rich folks, but obviously there's a lot of talk out there, everybody will get hurt, and that's going to be the argument from the other side. Aren't you helping Pritzker win if you make your governor look bad?
Well, if the governor vetoes the budget and your constituents don't think this is a good idea, I guess I come down on the notion, and this maybe sounds corny, but I think lawmakers are supposed to represent what their constituents desire. And if it's pretty clear that your constituents don't want this kind of back and forth brawling, then I'm going to vote for a budget. And it's interesting because there's all this talk about Madigan and a 32% tax increase. Nobody really mentions that when Governor Rauner proposed his budget, he spent every penny of that 32% income tax increase.
And they still don't have quite enough. Well, he says he'd have enough if they do some other things.
Having his cake and eating it too, I guess.
Well, we'll see where that goes. Beyond the budget, obviously, because of unfortunate events around the country and various schools in particular, gun control or things like that, measures about firearms, continue to be in front of the legislature. There was a vote in the House to pass a bill and they got 80 votes on it, which means a lot of, I think it was 10 or 11 Republicans joined in. A bill that would allow family members, I think, with law enforcement to go to court and get guns taken away from people they think are dangerous, kind of like an order of protection. That's one thing. But still hanging out there are other things, like if there will be a 72-hour waiting period to buy any firearm, or as an original bill had passed, to buy assault-style weapons. The governor uses a mandatory veto, which hasn't yet been acted on that, and one of the things he added in was allowing schools to use some of their local money for police officers or guards. And the other thing is reimposing the death penalty, which kind of came in out of the blue and has gotten a lot of attention and really a lot of negative editorials saying it's a political move now that Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011 and hasn't used it since, I believe, was it 1999? Mm-hmm. Anyway, what's going to happen with all that stuff, or can we tell at this point? Brian, you think something will happen by the end?
I think we still see attempts to move some of the governor's ideas as individual pieces of legislation. And the real question, I don't think very few people in Springfield would say that the governor's mandatory veto was even constitutional. It was even like a legal.
Because there's so many.
It's because you're not
packed with so much stuff that wasn't necessary.
There's Supreme Court precedent that says you're not supposed to use sort of make a Christmas tree out of it, right, where you hang all these different things on it. But there's also just a long-standing distaste that the Speaker has had for the mandatory veto, as well as House rules that prevent that sort of thing. The real question is then, the governor did stake out some, for him, new and surprising positions on gun control. The bill that he got would have imposed this 3-day waiting period for buying, what are defined as assault weapons. That's the legal term they use. I know some people don't like that phrase, but
right, yeah.
That would be in the statute. He actually said, no, let's expand that to all weapons, shotguns, handguns, everything.
Handguns it has it, but it would, even hunting rifles.
Right,
hunting
rifles,
yeah.
Right. That was already in the law, you're right. So he took some sort of pro-gun control positions with the death penalty added on, right? And so the question is, will he support those things individually?
Right, and he says we want a comprehensive view, which makes
so
you think maybe he'll say, well, if it's not comprehensive, I can't do the single bill that the gun folks don't like.
Right, so far his office is hedged. They've left enough room for him to support or oppose these by saying, yes, it's not comprehensive, or, well, half a loaf is better than no loaf, although, as Charlie has pointed out a lot of times in the past, this governor is not known for taking even 90% of a loaf.
And we should say about the death penalty, he put very limited parameters on what that would apply to. It's for killing a police officer or killing more than one person, which he calls mass murder. And you couldn't convict by reasonable doubt, but no doubt. If that is, and there's some question if that's a legal theory that can even be done, but he says, if everybody sees the person and they know, I have to wonder, defense is not always did you shoot or not. Defense is your state of mind.
I've said this before. I've been on a jury. I've been on a jury for somebody we convicted somebody of murder. And there was a lot of evidence in the case, but was there was not reasonable doubt, but was there absolutely no doubt? I can't say that there was. I think that's an incredibly high standard. You'd have to have somebody perhaps on videotape holding their ID card clearly, visible in the camera. I mean, it's just a really
even then
high burden.
You couldn't be sure, because look how many exonerations have occurred after someone confessed to a crime, but they confessed because they were tortured by the police.
Sure.
and we hope that doesn't go on anymore, but obviously the world isn't perfect, but there is a history of that in Chicago.
Yeah.
And,
Or not even
John
torture. I
Birch.
mean,
Yeah,
and if
get
you're a
beat
younger
up.
person, you don't even have to be tortured or beat up. You can just be sort of, there's been evidence about young people can be coerced pretty easily just because they're so fearful and confused about the situation.
Yeah. So tough situation. We'll see where that goes. On to not necessarily a legislative or a budget thing, but an odd and interesting distraction that came up this last week, and it once again, Speaker Madigan was put on the spot about is he protecting women in the right way and the Me Too movement, and it happened in this way. State Representative Kelly Cassidy from Chicago, it turns out I didn't know previously, had a part-time job with Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart's office. She came out and said in the recent days that she felt like Speaker Madigan's organization had, or people had put pressure on her, and she ultimately resigned from that job. She says the reason for that, she believes, is when some women came forward in the past, or one in particular, and said they were harassed and Speaker Madigan didn't act quickly enough, Kelly Cassidy said she publicly said, I want a more independent investigation, so she thinks she was critical of the Speaker. So then she says that shortly after that, Tim Mapes, the Speaker's Chief of Staff, called the Sheriff's office just to see if she still had a job. And then a while later, Sheriff Dart, a former legislator, by the way, wanted legislation to make sex offenders of people who, I guess, expose themselves in prison, which has been a problem in dealing with public defenders and stuff. And she opposed that bill, and a state representative, she says, Bob Rita, took the bill and said to her, how can you be against what your boss wants? And she thought that was another message from Madigan, and therefore she quit her job, came out publicly saying Madigan's not, there's too much power, and a lot of people, including Daniel Biss, were putting out messages, thank you, Kelly Cassidy, for taking on the Speaker. And Speaker Madigan's response to all this was, we want an investigation, and he forwarded a letter to the Legislative Inspector General, and that was a position that was empty for a while before all of this happened a few months ago with women claiming problems within Madigan's organizations. But saying, let's investigate this and we'll cooperate. Charlie, what does it amount to?
Well, we'll have to see where the investigation goes. But one of the things I find, what would you say? I guess if I were advising Republicans, I would tell them don't be too loud on this issue, because as somebody who's watched the legislature up close for 20 some years and then a little bit at a distance from the university for another 20 plus years, sexual harassment and boorish behavior is not a monopoly of House Democrats. It's in both chambers and it's both sides of the aisle. There are oafs in each party's caucus. And so I think what we need to look at, rather than singling out the Speaker as being, as I think Lieutenant Governor Sanguinetti suggested, that he was the
Harasser in chief?
The harasser in chief.
Yeah, she went on, was it a radio show or some
Yeah.
appearance? And so the governor didn't have to do it, but he had Evelyn Sanguinetti say this, or she said it, and got some publicity.
Well, and she
In a rare public
maybe
appearance.
misspoke, because I don't think there's been any allegations that Madigan personally has done this. I think
Right.
Cassidy's point is,
And Cassidy said Madigan, she believes Madigan didn't do it, but the atmosphere he sets is that his
well,
people do it.
the
Yeah.
the organization and his subordinates and the people who are loyal to him would act to protect him just without a word being said, that they see this as their role. But I think it's something that needs to be rooted out. And I think it has to be investigative. These women have to be taken seriously. And as I say, I think it cuts across all party caucuses. So I would not try and make this too heavily a partisan thing.
Right, yeah, and the governor came out too, but Brian, obviously the Republicans are jumping on this as another Madigan problem, but as Charlie said, we'll see if, where the whole thing goes. And of course, there's calls for more of an independent look at this than even the Inspector General of the legislature, so.
Well, and I just think we need to be absolutely clear, and you have been, but just to make sure we put a fine point on it, this is not about the Speaker doing anything that is sexual harassment.
Right.
Right. This is about people in his organization, and it's a question of power. And if this were, if Representative Cassidy had criticized the Speaker not on how he was handling these allegations of one of his aides having harassed another aide in his campaign organization, if this was about his handling of the budget or something, and he, some of his people, moved to take away what I think some might call a patronage job. I don't really know what she did. Like you, I'm surprised that she was employed with the Cook County government.
I'm sure it was fine work. Yes.
There's a long history of this, and in fact, the person who made the call, Tim Mapes, 10 years ago, his wife lost a state contract for when Governor Blagojevich started going after family members of state legislators for not being supportive of him enough. It is curious, though, that we're not talking about any other issue, as I said. So, it would not be surprising if you question the speaker publicly. There may be some repercussions. Scott Drury learned that. He's not the chairman of any committees. He's got a seat just in front of teacher.
Right, he's
in the
Democratic House member who didn't vote for Speaker
Madigan.
For Attorney General on that issue,
and he's
didn't do very well.
He's persona non grata on the House floor nowadays.
It's also because he keeps calling himself a prosecutor, which he is. But anyway. Yes.
He relishes being independent to some extent, I think. But it's clearly had a political cost for him. So I think in any other context you could say, well, this is hardball politics in Springfield. But given the national reckoning we've been having since the Harvey Weinstein case came to light last fall and the #MeToo movement and all this other stuff, why anyone would go anywhere within 100 feet of doing anything that could smack of retaliation is kind of a head scratcher. And we don't have all the facts yet, but a lot of people have said on the record that these phone calls were placed, that this, so, to the extent that, what we know so far.
We don't know the intent of
We don't know the intent, and we should add, Cassidy was not forced out of the job. She chose to leave the job.
Yeah, and I think Bob Rita said he didn't recall saying anything about her boss. He just, wondered why she wasn't for the bill or something.
Well, one of the interesting things is this is a particular bill that Sheriff Dart wanted to deal with this abysmal behavior of people who are in detention cells, who expose themselves and
etc.
And this is a real problem if you're a female public defender.
And you have to look at this
and yet they're running into a situation where a lot of legislators this year don't want to enhance.
Well, that's the thing, and the bill was sent to a judicial committee where the stated, what would you say, the
policy
intent,
this year?
Yeah, the policy is that we're not going to recommend for passage any bill that enhances penalties. We don't care what the
prison time, because
is.
Prison time, there's so many people in prison, and maybe that's not the answer to everything.
Yeah,
right?
And so that was the stated policy. Now, Madigan controls where bills are sent. So in that sense, maybe by him sending the bill there, you could say, aha, he's reacting against Cassidy or Dart or whatever. I don't think that's true. I think the reason he sent it there is because the Legislative Black Caucus is very concerned about all these enhancement penalties because they believe, with some justification, that these kinds of onerous burdens fall more heavily on young men and people of color than they do on guys who look like any of us three. And so there's a reason why we should stop and take a look at this idea of just jacking up the penalties for everything. On the other hand, I would argue I would have made an exception for this because that kind of behavior is just horrible. And saying that you have to register as a sex offender, that's,
it's not prison time, really.
No, it's not
but
prison time.
It's obviously, it imposes on your life and where you can live, and if you can get a job, and it's a terrible thing. On the other hand, you're right, the behavior is really bad.
Yeah, and back in the day, and I suppose this is not politically correct, but back in the day, what would happen was a couple other prisoners would just beat the crap out of whoever this guy was.
Yeah. Well, on to, let's do something, back to politics from policy. Tim Schneider was re-elected last weekend as the Republican state chairman. Mark Shaw, who had challenged for a while and was in kind of the Jeannie Ives conservative camp, the people who haven't liked Governor Rauner on social issues, came into the fold in an agreement before the party met, and they all said, okay, we're together now. There's still a little question about Bob Winchester's member of the State Central Committee if he was properly not elected and defeated by Chapin Rose, the state senator. But the party officially is together. Some people are still not happy. Is the Republican Party cured itself enough to get through this election season looking unified, or maybe not yet? Brian?
Well, as a noted State House personality says, I don't do predictions, but it's a high hill to climb, I'll say. I mean, you can look at the vote totals out of the primary when Governor Rauner barely won by just, 3 percentage points over
Jeannie Ives.
Jeannie Ives, state representative. And I think you can just feel the lack of enthusiasm out there when you were looking around the primary. I saw Jeannie Ives' yard signs and campaign things everywhere, and you hardly saw anything for Governor Rauner. I think that people are sort of exhausted from the last few years of constant fighting, and I just don't know that people feel a lot of, you don't get the sense that there are a lot of people who are, passionate for him the way they might have been for President Obama, or, I mean, then,
Yeah, and well, there's a lot of passion. There's a lot of
President
passion
Trump,
for
exactly.
President Trump, but our governor still almost never says President Trump's name and tries to stay away from that kind of vitriol.
Which itself might have,
Which is
and
interesting.
I've used that against him and said that
he did.
he was distancing himself too much.
I'd like to get to one other thing, because Charlie and I were talking before the show began about hemp. Charlie, and you know that apparently, have they passed a bill now to allow production of hemp in Illinois?
Yeah,
and
I believe
and it's
the
up to the governor.
legislation
And this
passed
is
this
a
week, and it's on the
marijuana-type
governor's
product,
side.
but it's not a hallucinogenic product.
No, it's basically the same plant. It's cannabis, but it's strains that have been developed so that they have virtually no trace of the substance in
The THC or
marijuana
whatever.
that makes you high. And so it's a very valuable fiber. And back in the day, in the early history of our nation, people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson grew hemp as a crop.
And you make
and-
rope,
Yeah, and
right?
you can make
You can
fabric
make
and rope and all kinds.
And
it's
you
said to be a
can
cash
make
crop.
clothes out of
Right.
it. You can
So-
make paper out of it. You can make oils, like hand lotion and body lotion, stuff like that. So it's very versatile. And as a matter of fact, during World War II,
We only have about 20 seconds. Actually, we're just about out of time. Basically, what we're saying is the governor doesn't like marijuana, but maybe he should sign hemp, says
I think
Charlie
he should,
Wheeler.
because it'd be good for Illinois farmers.
Okay. With that, Charlie Wheeler and Brian Mackey, thanks for your discussion. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.